Okay, as it's just Mr. Murray, I'll get on with it. So, uh, you can probably tell by the shared screen what this is going to be about. I just thought, as we are responsible for testing our own code and other people's code, we don't hire, we don't employ testers as such. We do it ourselves. I thought it'd be worth touching on some ideas about how to test effectively and what you should be testing and really why you should be testing. Um, so I think it's worth starting by considering what it is you want to test. We say test stuff, but what do we really mean by that? And I think there's roughly six areas of it identified that you might be testing in our day-to-day work. So I'll drill down into all of these in more detail as we go along. But essentially, we've got requirements. So by that I mean, are we meeting the specification that was given to us? Are we doing what the client wants us to be doing? Is the software doing what it's designed to do? Security, is it safe? Can it be hacked? Unexpected input. Are we handling any input which we may not have expected? Is there assumptions in our code which we haven't considered? Usability isn't something we are responsible for testing so much, but a little bit if we're doing front end work. Is it nice to use? Does it follow UX best practices? Browser support, does it work in all the main browsers? Does it work in the browsers which our users are using? And then accessibility, is it accessible for a wide range of needs? So let's look at requirements to start with. And with requirements, it can be easy to or useful to create a test plan. So the idea of this is to just think about what it is the software is meant to be doing and write it down. It could be in a formal sort of spreadsheet, or if you're just testing something yourself, it could be just jotted down on a bit of paper. But it's helpful to get down before you start testing what it is you want to be testing, and then you can identify whether something is actually a pass or a fail. Is it doing what it's meant to be doing? So, unexpected input and security. I've grouped these together as I think they are pretty similar. So, it's worth saying that big companies can get this wrong or throw uh, exceptions which maybe could be nicer. Twitter, for a while, if you included a zero width character in a tweet, you'd get an internal server error. And you might think, well, why would anyone want to do that? But maybe if you copied and pasted a string or a sentence which contained a zero width character somewhere in there, that's not a particularly nice error message. I'd expect them to be saying something more like, in this case, you can't tweet an empty tweet. So I don't know if anyone has ever heard of the big list of naughty strings. This is a repository I'm a big fan of on GitHub, which is a big text file containing a potentially dangerous or harmful string, one string per line. This that I'm showing here is just a very small segment of the big list of naughty strings. So, for example, some systems might not like if you put the word undefined as your name. There's probably no one who's got the name of undefined. There is someone I'll come to later on whose name is Mr. Null, which causes issues. 2-byte characters. You also get 3 and 4-byte characters. So these are characters where to render that single character, 2 bytes are required, or 3 or 4. And this can cause issues if you think of something like Twitter, where you've got 140 characters to play with. You should be thinking about, well, what is a character? Is if you've got a character which is made up of 2 other characters or multiple bytes, or in the case of emojis, where you can combine multiple emojis together to create new emojis, for example, how do you count those in terms of something which is trying to validate length? We've got the Scunthorpe problem, which is all about legitimate strings which can be blocked by profanity filters. You might think this is a problem which doesn't affect anyone, but Scunthorpe actually has 82,000 people who live there. So it's potentially a big number of people that these sorts of issues can affect. And so this part of a big list of naughty strings is collating real words, real names, real URLs, which have caused real problems in.
Bradley, I used to be subscribed to a daily football newsletter, and because so many people were getting blocked, they started changing Scunthorpe FC's name to Firewall FC whenever they referred to it, in order to let it get through.
Fantastic. Well, there we go. Some a real life example there. And yeah, quite a difficult problem to solve. It's a bit of a balancing act, but it's definitely something to consider, how you want to balance the need to be blocking unsuitable strings, but balanced against the idea that you might be blocking legitimate stuff. And you definitely need to be considering who the audience is, I'd say. And if you're implementing a profanity filter, it's worth having this conversation with the client, I'd say, and deciding where to draw that line. Some strings here which crash specific versions of iOS. I think it's highly unlikely that these specific strings would crash any of our own code. I don't know why they did crash iOS, and specifically the iMessage app, but I think it demonstrates that it's worth testing stuff which you don't expect to be a problem. So clearly no one at Apple anticipated this problem, but it was a problem all the same. Presumably it came from specific sequences of multi-byte characters triggering some sort of exception.
Wouldn't you possibly say, Bradley, that that's an excellent example of why testing can't always win? Because there's no way a test department is going to have figured out that test in advance of somebody accidentally discovering it.
You're right. I'd say a case where the test department couldn't have anticipated that. The developers possibly could have.
Do you know what was behind that, or is it just an example? What was the problem?
Apple have never said, so we can only speculate.
Okay.
But yeah, I'd imagine that it was probably they clearly fixed it somehow. That there was a bug there that maybe some developer should have spotted. Script injection, cross-site scripting. This is only a small segment of about 200 variations of this, the big list of naughty strings have. If you wanted to be thorough, you could just loop over all of them as part of a automated scripting package and just put all of them in all your fields and see if you have any problems. They pretty much all are trying to either trigger an alert or a console log or something equally obvious. So that's it for the big list of naughty strings, but I'd advise going and having a look at the actual repo. I've just picked out a few examples, but just by reading through, they've got comments about all of them. Some stuff I would never have known about. Some stuff which is specific to particular bits of technology. So they've got some Ruby specific stuff in there, some stuff that is specific to XML parsing libraries. So it's worth looking through. It can, give you an idea of vulnerabilities that you maybe had never considered before, or even stuff which isn't vulnerabilities as such, but just leads to undesirable results, so like the Scunthorpe problem. So I'm now going to move on to the idea of falsehoods. So this is stuff which developers and non-developers believe to be true, that isn't true. Most of its example come from this GitHub repo listed here, which collates various articles on this subject. Again, it's an interesting repository to look through, and can make you think about your testing and your coding in ways which you maybe hadn't before. So Christopher Null, I touched on this one earlier. This chap wrote a nice article. He's a journalist, and he wrote about the various issues he had with his rather unfortunate name. I think the biggest issue he had was with the Bank of America for several years, with communications going missing or not reaching him because of mail packages removing parts of his name, parts of his email address. And so it's worth considering that maybe your validation you're doing, perhaps you're checking for null values and matching strings with the string of null rather than actual null values, which could be leading to the incorrect thing happening. This is an example from last week that I noticed. Ronnie O'Sullivan has a apostrophe in his name. If you're not careful, you could be stripping that out or overly slashing it, as is happening here. I actually noticed this example originally in the context of the country Cote d'Ivoire, which has an apostrophe in that country's name, which is again the sort of thing which can go wrong. There's also countries which have special characters in their names. This is good things to be testing, because it's edge cases. It's not the usual scenario, but it's a scenario that could well happen in the lifetime of a bit of software we write. So another problematic name, Amar Elderway, and this man had problems booking flights. So the airlines use very old or shared bits of IT infrastructure that date back many years, many decades even. and they pass around strings like the one listed on this slide. And what this is saying here is the NM means start the name command. The one means there's one passenger, and then it's got his name, and then it ends in Mr. And what this isn't doing is differentiating between Mr. A and someone who is Amar and hasn't given a title. And this can cause problems with flights because airlines and governments are very keen on what's on your ticket matching what's in your passport. And so you can see how problems can arise here. I think this is a nice example of how software can last a long time. And clearly, when this passenger name record system was developed several decades ago, but they clearly didn't anticipate this case. It's quite possible that when they developed this, that they were only assuming Latin character sets for names, for example. Now, quite possibly, they were assuming that people in countries where people don't have Latin character sets won't be flying. And yeah, this system probably doesn't handle that.
It's one of my favourite comic links in the left-hand corner for anybody who's missed that.
I think this is actually for the next slide. I felt I couldn't do this talk without referring to Little Bobby Tables. I was imagine that everyone's seen this before, but I'll give you a moment to read it if you've not. So really just a nice example of not trusting the data you're given, even if it apparently comes from a trusted set of users. And it is possible that someone somewhere really has named their child a SQL injection query just for the hell of it.
I bet dozens of them were registered shortly after this comic came out.
It wouldn't surprise me at all. So I've really gone through just names there, but that's really just scratching the surface. There's problematic sort of emails and postcodes and addresses that all tie into the subject of validation. These are difficult things to validate, and there's lots of falsehoods here and assumptions that we probably have, especially as Westerners living in England. So, for example, plenty of countries worldwide where they don't have postcodes, or they call postcodes something different, or their postcodes are for different things. So I think there's African countries where postcodes are only used for very, very specific cases, for example. So houses don't have postcodes, but offices do, or vice versa. Date and time zones is again another area where there's all sorts of assumptions you could make there about leap years and people starting a transaction in the UK, getting on a flight and trying to finish the transaction in France. All sorts that could go wrong if someone did that. I'm sure someone's tried. Another assumption that if you're trying to put country codes into YAML files, Norway's ISO country code also is the YAML for false. That could easily cause issues. And if you look at that initial GitHub repo that I mentioned, there's a whole list of articles on specific areas such as names or emails or postcodes of falsehoods and assumptions that you might have about your code that are probably just plain wrong. So another thing that I think is common for us to be testing in a completely different vein this time is browser support. So you're unlikely to be testing browser support at the same time you're testing for valid input values and for security hardening and for unusual parameters. But yeah, it's something equally valid in the world of testing. So I'd say that really you want to be testing in the four main browser families rather than focusing too much on specific browsers. So for example, you want to be testing in a Blink browser, but it doesn't really matter whether that's Chrome or whether that's Edge or whether that is something like Brave or Vivaldi or one of the dozens of Blink-based browsers that have popped up over the last few years, as essentially they're all running exactly the same thing with a different skin. So if you're testing in Edge and then you go through exactly the same test suite in Chrome, you're probably wasting your time. Same goes for WebKit, and you've got Safari as the most well-known WebKit browser, but WebKit is open source and anyone can make a WebKit browser if they want to. I've mentioned Trident and Edge HTML here. It's important not to get these confused with what we currently think of as Edge, which is a Blink-based browser. So Edge HTML was running Edge until about a year ago, in which case they decided to rebuild Edge with Blink. So rather confusing. You've got Internet Explorer and Edge as of a year ago running Trident essentially, and then they changed to use Blink. So yeah, I'd be testing Internet Explorer over and above Edge. And then you've also got Gecko/Quantum for Firefox. Firefox doesn't have many forks, but again has one or two. In terms of exactly which within these families you want to be testing, I think it's worth looking at real world data, especially your own real world data. So looking at Google Analytics, if you have that data, is tremendously useful. If you don't have access to the Google Analytics data yourself, there's probably someone who does. Definitely worth asking for this data. So if we look at these example screenshots I've put here, you can see that in this case it's very much worth focusing on desktop browsers. Almost pointless spending too much time on tablet browsers, as there's almost no one using the site on a tablet. If we look at the specific browsers, in this case, it's roughly matching what we would expect. A relatively high number of Firefox users compared to the sort of global statistics. So possibly you'll be thinking, let's prioritize Firefox over something like Edge. I touched in more detail previously on how you find this data in Google Analytics in previous presentation. That's on YouTube. Might be worth revisiting that if you've forgotten or if you've come across a case where this would be useful. So that's really it for browser testing. The other thing I think you should be testing within the browser though is accessibility. I think this is quite a tough area to be testing. I think this is probably the toughest to get started with out of all the areas I've mentioned. You really have to grasp what accessibility is. So that could easily be a talk in of itself. But essentially, you want to be testing: is this bit of software, is this service, is this website going to be usable by as wide a variety of people as possible, and people with various disabilities, whether they're temporary or permanent disabilities. So I'm just going to run through a couple of tools that I would be recommending using for accessibility testing. So browsers increasingly, especially in the last year or so, are starting to build in tools for accessibility testing. So this first screenshot on the left is showing the inspect tool. So when you hover over an item, it will now show you whether the contrast is meeting good guidelines. It's showing you whether the font size is big enough, whether it's keyboard focusable. With the keyboard focusable stuff, there's definitely a level of understanding you need to have about whether something should be keyboard focusable. It might give you a tick that something's keyboard focusable when really it shouldn't be. That's something you really have to judge for yourself. On the right here, I've got a screenshot of the Lighthouse audit. Lighthouse, if you don't know, is the audit software that Chrome have been developing for the last few years. It now powers things like page speed insights. It powers things like the audits within Google Search Console. It can be run standalone from CLI. People often build it into sort of continuous integration testing servers, stuff like that. But you can also run it sort of ad hoc whenever you want to from DevTools. And I've just run a accessibility audit on the Bright-Minded site, and we can see it's given us a score of 81 out of 100. So not bad, but room for improvement. And then it's given us a breakdown of what we could be improving. Lighthouse can also test performance. It can test how well optimized you are for SEO, and a few other things as well. So just generally, Lighthouse is another good tool for our testing that we should be doing. Next tool I want to mention is Totally, or Tote Accessibility by Khan Accessibility. It's by Khan Academy, sorry. You might have seen this A11Y before. The 11 refers to the 11 characters between the A and the Y in accessibility. So just a shorthand for writing out accessibility, really. And you can download this as a browser extension or as a bookmark linked, or you can load the JavaScript directly in your page, and it will test whether your headings are correct, whether your contrast is correct. What I like about this tool is it's very lightweight. It's really just scratching the surface, but it's very quick and easy to get started with. I think it's very approachable. So good if you've not done any accessibility testing before. It's sort of a good place to start. Sort of more heavier possibly, but more sophisticated tool which gives greater sort of coverage of possible issues is the Wave tool by WebAIM. WebAIM are a good organisation that do lots of sort of writing about the state of accessibility on the web. They do things like crawl the top 1,000 or top million. I can't remember which, how big a sample size they take, but they crawl a decent number of sites each year to see how accessible they are, and see where the places that people are commonly failing. And we can see here it's showing that there's 20 contrast errors on the Bright-Minded site. So there's a number of tools there that I've gone through for accessibility testing: Wave, Total Accessibility, Google Chrome tools. None of these are going to test absolutely everything, but they're all a good starting point, and especially they're all fairly approachable if you don't really know what you're looking for in the accessibility space. So if we go back to where I started, thinking about what is it you're testing, so we can see that these are all very different areas that you should be testing. These all warrant sort of investment and time to test these specific areas on their own. But I think that they're all equally important for various reasons. The requirements are sort of important for figuring out are we doing what we've been asked to be doing? Is the software doing what the client has paid us to provide to deliver? Security testing is, very important for making sure we're not opening ourselves up to problems down the road. Both for security and accessibility, you've got sort of a legal obligation to be meeting certain standards there. Browser support, just sort of testing that you're making your service, your website, usable by as many people as possible. So just some closing thoughts to finish, really. I strongly believe it's better for you to break something than for your users to do so. So be brave when you're testing, but whatever it is you're testing. I don't think anyone's going to mind if you break a service that we've built, as long as it's in a test area or as long as it's not gone live yet. Much better you do it than someone successfully performs a SQL injection attack on something we've built or whatever it might be. Don't be fooled by your assumptions. It's easy to assume that because we're in the UK, everyone is going to have names in Latin character sets, that everyone's going to have a first name and surname. That's really not true. One falsehood that I didn't include, which I was thinking of including, was Picasso, the artist. I think he had something like 30 names officially. That's going to cause issues if you've got a sort of character limit in your database columns, or if you're asking for a first name and a last name, which of those 30 names is his first name and his last name? And I think 30 names is an extreme example, but it's quite common, even across Europe, to have cases where the culture is to have multiple middle names or to have multiple surnames. There's places where you take both your father's and your mother's surnames until you're married, for example. I think it's also important to not lose sight of what you're testing, especially with the idea of requirements. So don't get bogged down testing that something works if that something wasn't what we were asked to deliver in the first place. So yeah, I'd make sure that we've delivered what we were asked to deliver, and then make sure that it's meeting, that it's handling stuff which doesn't meet our assumptions and handling edge cases, and then test more and more edge cases until you're confident that every possible avenue has been tested. But yeah, the important thing really is to make sure you test. That's really what I want to be encouraging people to do. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bradley. Any questions, observations?
I've had that issue with names before, actually, on forms. It's really annoying.
There's no testing for performance. Any reason why?
Testing performance is a good one. So something that I hadn't considered. There's probably other types of testing that are also missing from my list.
Nowadays is such an extensive, just a website is such an extensive collection of services and an issue. Yeah, you're right. There are probably more things that should be tested. I like the fact that you call that unexpected input. So by definition, it's unexpected. So it'd be very difficult to know that you have to test for it. And I agree with Mr. Cowan. Most of the time, these things are things that you find out retrospectively, and sometimes, in fact, it's highly impractical to test all of the cases, because every edge case will have its own edge case as well. So that's a tricky one for me. It's one of those unknowns. One of those things that you don't know you should know until it happens.
I guess it ties into the idea of thinking about what you're testing. I guess I talked about looking at browser stats, Google Analytics in relation to browser testing. You could be certainly looking along similar lines in terms of what sorts of users do you have in your database. Are your users all from the UK? Are they all from Europe? Or do you have users in Asian countries where names really do start to wildly differ from the names we're used to? And at that point, you might be wanting to talk to someone from a contact that maybe the client has about trying to figure out what sort of names might we be expecting there.
I think what's good about that list that you drew people's attention to, Bradley, is that the skill here is knowing what could go wrong, so that you can ask your client how much of the craziness they want to defend against. I've never yet seen an online form which has got 30 fields for a second name, for example. Because although somebody may have 30 second names, nobody's really interested. People are discriminating. They can probably work a way around it. But if you don't know that, and I suppose that list is a great way of making many of the unknown unknowns a bit more likely to come up while you're thinking, so that you can have the conversation, so you don't make dumbass mistakes.
And I'm sure anyone with 30 names isn't going to object to choosing their primary couple. What they will object to is if they put in all 30 and they get a 500 error, or it causes some deep down problem when that name is then rendered in a ticket that gets printed out, or in an account area. So it's really about it doesn't matter if you're not handling every possible input. It does matter if unexpected input is causing actual errors which matter, things like 500 errors, or database errors, or errors when you try and print stuff. Or
in which of those cells do you put unit testing? Is that requirements?
I guess I'm looking at this from the point of view of someone who is testing the bit of software is doing what it's meant to be doing. So really from
Oh, the black box. I see. Black box testing.
Yeah, really from not necessarily a developer's point of view. So
Right.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, a developer can be testing their code, but I think that they're generally testing, you know, is the code doing what the code was coded to do, which is a different sort of thing in my mind. It's, you know, is 1 + 1 successfully equaling 2, not is my calculator working as a calculator. So it's a subtle difference, but
I think this example will come up quite often when you think about database field widths. Because I started programming on a computer with 1K of memory, I tend to be very tight-fisted about the amount of data you could put in a column in the database. And the spreadsheet, the application form that Charlotte's been working on has got a number of examples of fields which are only a handful of bytes big. And I am making assumptions that periodically we have to revisit, or we can find in the logs where somebody's name was too big for the 256 characters I've allowed them. So the code there, the unit test would be fine. The code is perfect. It's my assumptions that are wrong. So it's a good example of that distinction that you're making. Unit test wouldn't have found a problem.
So I guess true testing should be done not by the developers.
quite probably not. I guess that's why you do things like open pull requests and ask the client to test stuff before we put stuff live.
Yeah.
Because when a developer is coding, I think it's natural that their head is full of assumptions about what they've been asked to do and the data that they're expecting, which it's not realistic to catch at that point in time. I've just switched the screen here to a full big list of naughty strings, so we can see the sort of reserved strings we were talking about initially, some numeric strings. This is all fairly safe to start with, unlikely to cause issues, I'd imagine. As we go down, we start getting to stuff which could cause issues. Stuff here, we've got comments like this may appear different for some viewers. A lot of this comes down to the browser you're looking at. It's certainly possible that if you're building a sort of dashboard yourself, the way that you're rendering certain characters could be causing glitches.
Do you think because it's so complicated, sometimes even when you're checking for a pattern or something, there could be something that breaks the regular expression that you're using to test it and so on, that there's so many unlimited edge cases, and people are submitting patches and security patches to open source versions of these tests all the time, that if you're trying to do it manually, you're maybe wasting your time, because wouldn't it be better to use a framework where these things are done by default and you get sort of updates given to you for free, when the client's probably not paying you to solve all these low-level computer science problems?
I think it's definitely a balancing act there. We've touched on this idea before, I think, of we shouldn't assume that just because we're using WordPress or Laravel or whatever framework we might be using that they're going to save us, because quite often they're not.
Yeah, certainly you need to test either way and make sure everything's safe. I was just thinking, it's the same the other way. You might want to test whether something's user input, whether that's echoed out into your page, and whether that's safe. Whereas there's some frameworks, the default way to sort of echo something out or to put it in the page will be sanitized, and it will only be if you write some code that says, inject dangerous the unscaped HTML or something, that would happen. Whereas I think it's difficult to remember every possible thing that you need to check if it's not the case by default that it's safe.
It is. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be bothering testing, some layers. Once you get to sort of the database of the operating system layer, at that point, I'll definitely be thinking, well, let's just assume that that's safe. But as you get closer and closer to what you're writing, I think you have to be thinking more and more at each step. Well, it's quite likely that if I've not been thinking about it, I've probably done something wrong. I think it's dangerous to assume, even if you've got auto escaping turned on, that it'll always do the right thing. Stuff like the way you are meant to escape stuff in a HTML attribute can be different to how you should be escaping stuff if it's just text outside of an attribute. Again, you want to be escaping differently or sanitizing differently before you push to the database. So it's definitely worth thinking up front about what sort of escaping and what sort of sanitization and what sort of safety measures you want to be putting in place for different contexts, and then testing for those. I think I'm in Edge here, which is doing a good case of rendering some of these really nasty strings well. If I load this up in Firefox, some of these strings would appear much differently. Yeah, if I was looking at this earlier, I was getting quite a different result, which is interesting. Here we go. So they've got different versions encoded in different ways, but you can see here there is some sort of characters which who knows what's going to happen if you try performing sort of string manipulation on some of these strings.
If a car just ran over those strings.
Yeah. And again, could cause real sort of rendering glitches depending on how you try to render these and what bits of software you were using.
What's your favourite one of these remarkable cases, Bradley?
In this file in particular, or just in general?
Well, just in general will do. And I'm thinking here most entertaining, most surprising, most delightful, rather than most useful to our customers.
I think some of the stuff around names and around the falsehoods I was talking about earlier. The other GitHub repo of that just listed various falsehoods and fallacies has some great anecdotes of people who just have awkward names that have caused some years of headaches from not being able to open bank accounts because their name wasn't valid, or people who name is just a single letter and therefore haven't been able to book a flight because
I have a long-standing best friend whose name is H, just capital H, and that one has never worked. There's been a relentless life of trying to explain why he's just got one capital letter as a name. In fact, he mostly has to sign himself off as HH because most of the world doesn't cope well with that at all. And it just got worse and worse with digitization, at least when he had to fill out an application form and explain to somebody. There were brains involved. But with the increasing digitization, it's made just worse and worse and a mess of his life for one capital letter.
It's probably a myth, but wasn't there someone with a number plate of null that couldn't get any speeding tickets?
Quite possibly.
I did hear that myth.
That could work.
I think modern software is probably more and more unlikely to come across these sort of issues, especially as more and more people are starting to use, things like TypeScript makes the case the likelihood of wrongly matching null string as null value more unlikely. But it's worth remembering that code can hang around for decades, and especially if we think back to that airline example I was talking about, where essentially they're still using an old system of typing strings of characters into terminals and splitting those characters up to figure out who is going to be on that flight. And
There's an interesting observation in what David was saying about using WordPress and Laravel. I thought, because now these sorts of platforms, you can still get them wrong, but they do make direct SQL injection. The decent ORM should be protecting for that out of the box. Laravel does good cross-site request forgery stuff in middleware, largely invisibly. And so you no longer have to worry about this sort of thing. And it struck me as it's a bit like null pointers in C. That you used to have to do very, very rigorous memory management when writing the program, really understand the environment that it was being compiled in. And then came languages that run at the end and mean that you can concentrate more on the functional program you're writing and less on the environment in which you're trying to use your tools. And you see a similar thing. So a language like PHP is full of crap, but some of the frameworks using PHP go a long way to mitigating what we have learned in the last 20 years of web development, so that they make an effort to defeat these things. Then we can find new things, and our languages and frameworks will start baking them in. This is an observation. I'm not drawing any conclusion from it.
Yeah, I guess the observation is now that I didn't need to add to my table the point about testing that we've not got null pointer exceptions. It means we can spend more time focusing on edge cases around unusual names or what happens when someone doesn't have a postcode, or the more human types of errors that I think are probably harder to test for in all honesty, because they require some thought about who your users are. It can be unclear at times who's responsible for defining that, but I think it's definitely worth giving at least some consideration to these edge cases and trying to at least have a plan for what's going to happen when they come up.
I think in terms of responsibility, Bradley, we as technologists are responsible of making our customers aware of some of the choices they need to make in order for their system to be plausible and work. So, we have to be able to explain to a customer, do they really need 30 middle name fields? They might. And if we were entirely unaware of these tasks, then we couldn't do our best by our customers, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
it's ours to raise them, and then whoever's paying can decide how far they want to go.
Yeah, with the name issue, I think it's down to the customer to figure out what they do when someone complains that their name doesn't fit nicely into a first name last name. But it's up to us to make sure we're not throwing that 500 error when someone exceeds the length of our database column or whatever. So in that case, it's semi-clear cut, but there's definitely grey areas in the middle which could fall down to anyone.
All right, thanks, Bradley.
Yeah, cheers, Bradley.
No problem. I'm intrigued, Charlotte. You said you had an issue with your name sometimes. I've been trying to work out what in your name would cause issues.
It was from when I've got like 4 names, and just some forms don't let you they don't have enough characters is usually the issue, rather than the number of names.
Like I see, so like middle names or something.
Yeah, and I think it's usually when a form just has one input thing for name rather than separate for first and middle and everything, and then the maximum characters, and I invariably go over it.
Yes, easy to. You see character limits once you start adding a few middle names in there.
I'm intrigued by why some of those strings that you mentioned, I think they're right in the first slide, about why they're not allowed, because some of them are quite obvious, but other ones to me really weren't. I don't know what I'm missing.
Yeah, expression. What's wrong with expression?
Yeah, that was one.
History list you're talking about.
Yeah, so like mocha and expression or evaluate. Like, what's wrong with that?
What's wrong with mocha?
I don't know.
Could it
So
be
evaluate would be like evaluating code.
language? Could it
Yeah, I
be
don't know.
something rude in a different language, maybe?
Maybe. But that's a good point. We've this list is only in English. I'm sure once you start looking at other languages, it gets even worse. I'm sure you've got the problem where there's completely legitimate words in English which just so happen to be a swear word in some other language, and vice versa.
It took me a while, but I got basement.
Please share.
Come on.
Oh yeah, I just got it as well.
Yeah,
This is the fun
In the
game.
middle.
the first two letters.
Yeah.
And the last letter. And what's left is the rude word. It's not rude, but
Yeah.
I don't know why they would cancel it.
The first two letters and the last letter.
Yeah, just remove them from that. What's left is
Oh, right. Okay. I thought you were saying that formed the word, and I was like, what's wrong with that?
no.
I mean, for all of these, you could probably find the commit where the term was added for
Expression.
an explanation of.
Expression. I don't get it. I don't get expression. Press? I don't know. I don't get it.
You determined to find the answer now, Bradley.
It's probably there somewhere if you dug. Is that it for questions there? I'll stop the recording if so.
Come on. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, buddy.
Yeah, thanks, Bradley.